Welcome everyone to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific? I'm Ray Powell. I'm here in California, and that's Jim Caruso, who I just had a very nice cocktail with in New York, of all places. But you, sir, are not in New York, and neither am I.
No, we both were there. We got cold and we ran away.
It's really cold there. Our guest today, Jim, is Isaac Stone Fish. He is the founder and CEO of Strategy Risks, which helps clients manage geopolitical risks with a focus on China. He's also the author of the critically acclaimed 2022 book, America's Second: How America's Elites Are Making China Stronger. He is a fluent Mandarin speaker, a former Beijing correspondent for Newsweek. He spent 7 years living in China, and he's basically been to every corner of the country. He also has a long list of prestigious associations and fellowships for the sake of time, of which I will not belabor. He is consulted and quoted by pretty much every major news source that you can think of for his China expertise. So thank you, Isaac, for joining us. And I will ask you our opening question. It begins thusly. The fashion chain Uniqlo recently announced it does not use cotton from the Chinese province of Xinjiang, where it is widely believed, but not admitted, that forced labor by an oppressed Muslim majority group known as the Uyghurs is used for its production. So in a BBC article, you were quoted as saying, not a single large company can remain politically neutral anymore. That got our attention. And both Beijing and Washington want companies to choose sides. So, Isaac Stone Fish, is it really impossible for large businesses to remain neutral on these geopolitically charged questions? And for all of us who don't work in business or policy, why should we care if that's true?
Thank you for having me. It is impossible to remain neutral. And businesses in the U.S. have struggles with American politics and being on both sides of, say, the DEI debate or other social issues that are Republican and Democratic side of it. And the situation between the United States and China is so much more difficult and more complicated. I'll answer first why this matters. It matters to the average consumer because this touches every single major U.S. consumer brand, from your Microsofts and Apples to your Coca-Colas, Pepsis, Tesla, anything has a China tie. And if it doesn't have a China tie, it's very marked by its lack of China tie. In terms of what Uniqlo's been through, Beijing wants companies to adhere to Chinese regulatory guidelines and Communist Party norms, and the U.S. government wants them to demonstrate to U.S. audiences and the rest of the world how they're reducing their China exposure, how they understand that they're going to balance on the United States side, and it's a very, very tricky act for companies to follow.
So, Isaac, does this apply only to U.S. companies, or do companies from third countries have the same problem?
It's a major problem for major companies all around the world. It's a bigger problem for Chinese companies because they have to deal with Xi Jinping's increasingly stringent leftward turn and declining business environment there, not to mention all the geopolitical risks that they face being Chinese companies globally. But French companies, British companies, Japanese companies, you name it, it's a major issue.
Okay, so if I am a major corporation, multinational corporation, and I am doing business with the U.S. and China, garden variety, what does it look like that I am being forced to choose sides? What choices am I being forced to make?
Some are major and some are small. Some are, do I say that Taiwan is a country? Do I say in my disclosures that we just opened a factory in Taiwan, or do I say we opened a factory in, say, Taipei district, which is what Beijing prefers it to be called? If I'm an airline, do I mention that Taiwan is a place that we fly to, or do I just put that under the China category? Do I source from Xinjiang? Do I potentially violate U.S. law and bring in products made from Xinjiang into the United States? Do I buy from a Chinese entity that makes the key widget that I need, but is 19% owned by a PLA entity or a sanctioned entity? Questions like that ad infinitum.
So, Ambassador of Australia to the United States, Kevin Rudd, who's a China expert, recently wrote a book that basically really emphasizes that Xi Jinping is all about party power. That is his absolute driving force. And that extends to the private sector. So presumably that also extends to the private sector that's owned by foreign companies or operating there. So if that's the case, how do you manage to navigate when the party only has one goal, which is power, that they can be used arbitrarily anytime they like? You stay in business.
It's so difficult. And to make it even more difficult, the party constantly eats its own. The example I like to cite is Bank of China, which is one of the 4 major state-owned enterprise banks, long seen as a policy bank. And so for a long time, financial institutions in China, the foreign ones would think, great, I'm doing this right. I have a partnership with Bank of China. The former chairman of Bank of China just got sentenced to death with reprieve, allegedly for corruption. Beijing doesn't say alleged, I'll say alleged. And so you think, oh, great, I did everything right. I partnered with the Communist Party, but now all of my transactions are being scrutinized, and I'm, big U.S. Bank A, and I had this deep partnership with Bank of China, and now I'm in a lot of trouble, billions and billions of dollars of trouble. So even working with the party and strengthening party power isn't the solution that will let you have a strong and simple business operations in China. The other thing is that the Chinese law requires any company that has at least 3 party members to have a party cell. And so if you're KPMG or McKinsey or whatever company that has a operation in China, you almost certainly have a party cell. And that is very difficult to navigate in the States. How do you explain to Congress that you have a party cell? You can't just say, hey, I'm following Chinese law and I'm implementing a party cell. And then what about branches in the States? Does Chinese law extend overseas? You could argue so, very much so. And so does a U.S. company that has operations in China and has, say, 300 employees who are Chinese nationals in Texas or Florida have to have a party cell? And then how do they deal with U.S. regulations on that? It's very, very challenging.
So in historical perspectives, what are we talking about? I mean, we have been kind of riding this train for a long time. Businesses have been doing business in China with great enthusiasm and optimism, at least going back a couple of decades, because they see a rising, class of consumers, a billion plus, now 1.4 billion strong. And they say, this is a great place for us to expand our business. When did we sort of get to the point where we're now asking these questions? What have we got ourselves into?
It's a great question. So you can divide it since Nixon's 72 rapprochement with China. You could say, okay, until 1989, it was enemy of my enemy is my friend. We're working with China against the Soviet Union. Then Tiananmen Square massacre, fall of the Soviet Union, and U.S. needed another justification to work with China, and that was trade will liberalize. So we will be allowed to trade with China so that Beijing becomes a democracy. Well, that didn't work. 2004, 2005, you had this idea that we're going to push China to become a responsible stakeholder in the global system that the U.S. built. That didn't work either. And that was perhaps the most misguided of them all because it assumed that China and the U.S. had the same interests, and they don't. That's a easy thing to say now, and it should have been an easy thing to say then. And so we're at this new era, this interregnum, this pre-war period. And that started in 2016 or 2018. And it's fascinating to watch the ways that policy DC, politics and the military will sometimes go with companies on this and sometimes will go against. Companies have started to realize in this new era that they've been mispricing China risk and they've been mispricing regulatory risk and they've been mispricing PR risk. And they're starting to realize the costs to them, to their brand, and also, frankly, to their ethical DNA of being too exposed to China.
And just to follow up, sorry, Jim, just to follow up on that, what role did the COVID situation play in that evolution?
There's a lot of frustration among the American population about Beijing's actions during COVID and a lot of blame. Some deserved, some I would argue not deserved, about how Beijing operated in the early days of COVID. And you talk about trying to avoid politics. It was so heavily politicized in this country. And so we don't still have a good sense of how COVID spread. And I certainly hope that we do get a sense of that. But also people started to realize how vulnerable their supply chains were. And for a long time, there was a supply chain innovation of just in time, with the idea that, okay, great, we're in a globalized world. Things can move from one place to another smoothly. But then they realized, oh, Beijing is punitive with its supply chains. And they have been for a long time. It's not new. It's new that the United States picked up on it and paid attention to it. And when you're not getting the medicine that you need because some Chinese company is either deciding not to send it to you or is banned from doing so by Beijing, you start to rethink your trade options.
So the past few days, we've seen China put restrictions, or not bans, on certain critical minerals needed especially by our defense sector. And the discussion is whether this is a opening salvo in response to Biden administration for the restrictions, or an opening salvo to Trump, of course, who's promising huge new tariffs on China. Where do you think this is headed?
It's a great question. What surprised me about this was the tit for tat nature of it. Beijing usually acts asymmetrically, where the US will sanction and Beijing will do something entirely different. Maybe they still will. They'll pick a company and they'll punish that company, and they'll encourage that company to lobby DC to change. I think one possibility is Beijing feels that Trump would make a deal. Trump infamously loves his deals, and there's a possibility that both sides are planning for some sort of grand bargain. Another possibility is that Beijing is trying to flex its muscles and show companies and the world its control over critical supply chains.
Well, just to follow up, in the let's make a deal category, current critical advisor to Trump, Elon Musk, has a huge investment in China, which would be severely impacting his overall net wealth if that goes away. So do you see him potentially playing a role in negotiating a deal?
Elon Musk is one of history's great conflicts of interest, and it's fascinating to watch how he navigates that. Jury's still out on where that'll go. I think what we have to remember with Musk and Trump is that at some point it feels, with the caveat that nothing in history is inevitable, it feels almost 100% inevitable that Trump and Musk will have a break at some point. And it's so critical to US-China policy when that happens, because Musk is one of the forces on the dovish side of the China equation by necessity, with the very healthy caveat that he also owns SpaceX, which is a weapons company, which has much, much lower China exposure and benefits from both close ties to DoD and NASA, but also to increase tensions between the US and China. So it's a not full ledger. And the Musk balancing act on China is one of the most important issues that we face.
So Xi Jinping has seen as have we all, by the way, has seen the Trump movie before, or at least the prequel, I guess, to the movie that's about to come out. What lessons do you think China has taken from Trump 1.0 when it comes to the issues of trade and business that it will seek to apply in Trump 2.0?
It's important to parse between the lessons Beijing should take, or how we think Beijing should think, and how they're actually seeing this. And the honest answer is I have no idea what's going through Xi Jinping's mind and how he sees these various signals and the quality of the information that he gets and how much he's cloistered from the reality of China and the world. My guess is that there's a sense that there are people close to Trump, Musk being one of them, Jared Kushner being another, Stephen Schwartzman, who Beijing feels like it has some influence over and can nudge either directly or through various intermediaries them to make sure Trump sees reason and sees how much China wants to make a deal and sees how much China doesn't want war and how rapidly China is developing and how domestically focused China is, and the other lines that representatives of Beijing will often trot out. So it seems to be that they will still play that strategy because they've played that since the 70s. it also seems to be that they feel like they can handle Trump, but that's just a guess. It's really hard to know.
Now, since we're in the guessing game, you want to guess what a deal might look like?
Gosh, so I will tell you what a deal could look like that I very much don't want it to be, which is a dramatic opening of China's economy in exchange for Taiwan. And so here is everything the US has ever wanted on China. And in exchange, you lose troops in Japan, troops in South Korea, and you say you won't defend Taiwan. So,
Yeah. No, it's okay. So America Second is your book, and the subtitle is "How America's Elites Are Making China Stronger." So, Isaac Stonefish, how are America's elites making China stronger?
So, what has happened over the decades is a class of Americans, often former diplomats or officials, very bipartisan, would work directly with Beijing and the party to strengthen the party, often at the interest of the United States. In their defense, this was official US policy until arguably about a decade ago. And even in the first Trump administration, there were still policies in place to strengthen the party. Compliance building, capacity building. Oh, we're going to train Chinese judges so that, and the idea in the American side was, I want to train Chinese judges so that they less follow party dictates, but really you're just teaching them how to do their job better, which allows them to more effectively control China. The more recent version, it's become much less popular to strengthen China in the United States. And there's now less of a disconnect between the professional class and your average American, insofar as they exist, who has long been critical of China and the Chinese Communist Party. Where we see it today is with some US businesses who are still trying to figure out how they can increase their exposure to China and how they can advocate for a very changed understanding in DC. I don't want to say that the trend of everyone moving towards being more hawkish in DC is the right way for things to go. I'm always nervous about unity. Consensus, great. Ability for dissent, great. I think that's also very important. I'm heartened that since the book came out in 2022, there's a lot more understanding of the problem with the Communist Party and a lot more understanding that the Communist Party doesn't represent Chinese people and that far and away the most hawkish people I've ever met on China are all Chinese. But I do caution us against silencing voices that are pro-China and pro-party, because we do need to have that debate. And the idea has to be, here's the reason why we don't support the Communist Party, and here's the reason why people shouldn't support the Communist Party, as opposed to, you can't say that, or I'm not going to let you speak because you hold those views.
I comment about the harshest critics of Chinese Communist Party are Chinese people themselves. Boy, that would keep me awake if I were Xi looking at Damascus these days. It's quite a statement, but there's no scope for action because it's a surveillance state, because it's not organized. Where does that go?
I always remember how little attention Chinese news media got internationally, and Beijing's snapping up of small, independent, dissident-run Chinese news stations around the world got so little attention. When Alibaba bought the South China Morning Post, one of the first things it did was shut down the Chinese news outlet, which they pretended was for cost-cutting reasons, but is so much more impactful because it was a relatively critical news outlet that broadcast into China, that printed into China. And, for all the problems of VOA and RFA, they do present critical material that Chinese people can have access to. There's so many different reasons why Beijing hasn't gone, or why China hasn't gone the direction of Syria. There's a Chinese expression about the spark that starts the wildfire, and that hasn't happened. For whatever that is, you picture the fruit vendor in Tunisia who lit himself on fire and then sparked revolutions around the region. And we haven't seen that in China. And maybe it's because of surveillance, maybe because it's economic levels of economic prosperity, maybe it's because of party control, maybe it's because of something with Chinese culture, though I usually doubt those arguments. But most likely it's a major confluence of factors that when the revolution does happen, if it does happen, will seem obvious that it was going to happen. And if it never happens, it'll seem obvious that it was never going to happen. It's so difficult to predict.
Having just lived through the weekend of Syria, I think I can associate with that, since I don't think anybody called that one, or at least nobody I was reading. So when you talk about and sort of U.S. elites, we often will talk about business usually being kind of at the top level of that, and that's because, of course, in the end, a CEO's responsibility is to return value to the shareholder, right? That's their responsibility. And obviously you run a risk management or risk strategy risks is the name of your company. When you're talking to businesses, how do you sort of frame this up for them when they're trying to figure out what should my exposure to China be? What are the opportunities, and really what are the risks?
We tell businesses, and it's very tailored depending on who they are, but we often will communicate how they're mispricing China risk and how they will invest a certain amount of money into a partnership or into their supply chains in China and not get the returns that they want and won't understand that. And so explaining to them, here's how this works in China and here's some of the externalities of your partnerships. The Bank of China example is a great one in terms of, hey, you thought the strategy was to partner closely with the Communist Party. Here can be a downside of doing that from a compliance risk perspective. Or, you've invested very heavily in your China supply chain, but what happens if you just can't get goods from those 5 factors? What does that mean to your business, and how do you price in that risk? It's also a question of safety for your people. How do you ensure that your people aren't running afoul of Chinese laws? It's a question also for your businesses elsewhere. What does it mean that you have this heavy China exposure? And then a lot of times we'll work with companies as they're dealing with tricky issues of Chinese competitors globally. And how do you understand that when you're competing with them in Thailand or Nigeria or Mexico? How do you understand those companies' ties to the party? How do you understand that? And how do you use that information in a way that's beneficial for your business?
All right, so the cost of doing business, the risk of doing business in China goes up. Meanwhile, the Chinese economy is, if not stagnating, significantly slowing down. Future investment doesn't seem to be ready to come in. China today announced new stimulus measures, although it's not very clear what those are. What's your outlook for the Chinese economy?
China, it's not that China is a data poor environment. It's that the quality of data in China is very poor. There's a huge amount of data, but people inside and outside the system don't trust the data. And so you have these scenarios where Beijing will announce stimuli, or they'll announce these packages and then they won't follow through. That happens everywhere, but it happens much more so in China. And governments will say they're going to do something, they don't do it, or they'll announce that they're pumping a certain amount of money, or that these are this job factor, this is that other factor. They turn out not to be true, or they're widely overstated. And the reason I'm bringing that up now is the question of the outlook of China's economy is also a reflection of the idea that China's economy now is not in a great place. I think that's broadly correct, but the specifics on that are very difficult to untangle, knowing exactly how the Chinese economy is doing, because we don't have good and accurate data. We have some better data, but it's not, I would argue, an accurate reflection. I think there's 2 schools of debate on where this is all going. And one is, because China's economy is doing poorly, Xi Jinping needs to focus internally. And he's not going to be aggressive externally because he's got to solve domestic problems. The second is, because China's economy is doing poorly, Xi Jinping needs to distract his population from the problems at home. So he's going to go to war or go adventure abroad, whether with Japan or Taiwan or the United States. I'm a bit more on the second camp, but again, very difficult to predict.
So let's talk about decoupling. Decoupling is often treated, I think, in conversation as if it's a light switch. Either you're for or against, you're on or you're off. But decoupling seems to be happening whether we're for it or not. And in your mind, what are the primary factors driving decoupling, and how much do state policy from the United States, from the West, and from China, how much do those matter to this whole decoupling process, and how much of that is just happening on its own?
The primary factor driving decoupling, and the primary factor that people misunderstand about U.S.-China relationship, is the same. It's Beijing. Beijing is the number one reason that global companies are decoupling from China. And it's not because they share US and EU fears about China in the party. It's because Beijing has made it more difficult to do business in China. And that's true for global companies. That's true for Chinese companies. Ask Jack Ma, founder of Alibaba. Ask Baofan, who still disappeared, founder of China Renaissance. Ask dozens or hundreds of Chinese CEOs. Don't ask them publicly. They won't answer that publicly, but ask them privately. And they'll tell you just how much more challenging of an environment it is. The next factor is companies and entities need to understand that there's a strong possibility that the US and China will go to war, and that there's a strong feeling among some who are senior in the Trump administration that the US needs to do something, perhaps everything short of war, perhaps an actual hot war, to prevent China from supplanting the United States as the global hegemon.
That's pretty dire. But let's think about it. So your one scenario is a wag the dog, where we're going to distract the Chinese populace from economic problems by having a global crisis. We're also seeing the U.S. apparently going to put more tariffs on Chinese goods. You see Chinese mercantilism actually increasing with just dumping the market with Chinese-made steel, EVs, solar panels. Europe now is starting to respond. And actually, we've been hearing some of ASEAN neighbors trying to say, we can't have you just killing our markets. So this economic squeeze is going to tighten. So what I'm hearing you say is we can't do anything about it economically, so we're going to go to war? Is that...
No. I'm saying there are plenty of people in the Trump administration who believe that war is inevitable between
on the U.S. side. Okay.
And what influential Chinese leaders think about war with the United States, I can only guess. And on the one hand, it's wonderful to analyze public statements because they're an important source of information. On the other hand, we can't say because this Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson said something or the People's Daily said something, it reflects what Chinese leaders actually think. So we have to understand that that's a black box. So Chinese leaders could be gearing up for war with the United States tomorrow. They could think it could never happen. They could, they're probably somewhere in between, but who knows? We have to guess. The guessing is important, but we have to understand that part of our model has to be opacity. I think from a economic perspective, we also have to really understand that in China, politics drives economics and not vice versa. There's so much statements from Chinese officials and business people, and this gets back to how we opened the conversation about this idea that, oh yeah, I want to depoliticize. I just want to trade, or I just want to grow together. Or I just want to something. But there's no depoliticizing something from a heavy political entity. Imagine the U.S. Commerce Department saying, hey, I'm a Democratic politician, but I'm going to leave aside any politics, and I'm just going to talk about U.S. Democratic political priorities. And they don't say that. They don't say, oh, I'm going to talk about political priorities. They just say, oh, I'm going to talk about, this is just what I think the reality is. But that's not the way the world works, and it's certainly not the way the Communist Party works. On the question of war, plenty of people think we're fighting a war anyway. Trade war, Cold War, cyber war. The question of whether or not that will descend into a actual proper hot war, depends a lot on what we decide to think of as an act of war. One can certainly imagine a different administration saying the wide-scale hacking into U.S. critical infrastructure counts as an act of war. I remember the sinking of the Chonon by North Koreans, but officially by no one, because South Korea decided that it wasn't necessarily North Korea that did it, so that they would prevent going to war. I think about the Marco Polo Bridge incident. That was the official start of the semi-official start of the Sino-Japanese War, because Japan trumped up charges against Chinese and used as an excuse to go to war. So a lot of that depends on the political reality on both sides. But I do feel like we don't talk nearly enough about the possibility of war between the United States and China, because people start to feel that if you're talking about it, you're advocating for it. But I have huge worries about some catastrophe happening, us going to war without thinking about it, and then rounding up Chinese and Chinese Americans here. We have an awful legacy of that. And that happens because we turn off that part of our brain that empathizes with folks, and we just rotely march into it. And so I do feel like we should be beholden on ourselves to talk about these things, to say, hey, this is a real possibility, like it or not. None of us have the ability to greatly influence it in any way. None of us do. And so we can talk about it. What we can influence is behaving ethically if it does happen.
Well, as a subject of a recent CCP-funded YouTube video saying that I'm a warmonger, I have an interest in this topic, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it to something a little more political, because that was the topic before. And I'm curious your thoughts on this select committee on the Chinese Communist Party. Obviously, they have been a flurry of activity, and it seems to be the one bipartisan arm of our government that is sort of working or at least moving in the same direction. And that seems to be in a pretty hawkish direction. What do you think about the select committee? Are they, in all of the things that they are doing, are they a net positive? Are they getting distracted? Are they beating war drums? What's your opinion about them?
I'm heartened by the work that they do and the standards that they bring to that work. It's DC, it's politics. They're not creating, a new conception of truth above the political reality. But I do find myself very much aligned with where they're going, what they're driving for, the spirit of bipartisanship, and the spirit of focusing not on the problems with Chinese people or Chinese civilization, but the Communist Party. Beijing representatives love to say that China has 5,000 years of history. That is true. So did Syria. The major issue is that the Communist Party has ruled China for 1.7, 1.8% of those years. And so the party at some point will fall. Impossible to say when, weeks, months, decades, hundreds of years. But China's longest dynasty was, I think about 400 or 500 years. And it's incredibly unlikely that the party will get anywhere close to that.
So when did you start changing your views about China and the inevitability of the Chinese Communist Party becoming so hardcore?
I don't think I changed on the party becoming hardcore. I think the party grew more hardcore, and I realized all of the things that I missed when I lived there. It's hard to understand how much you're censoring yourself when you're inside as opposed to when you're on the outside. And as a white American, I was always on the outside. There's a guy I met in Beijing who was born white, blonde hair, blue eyes, born in Beijing in 1966. Chinese was his first language, completely bilingual. So when I spoke Chinese, people would be impressed. They'd like it. I'd get in a nice chat, but they knew I was a foreigner. For him, it was uncanny because they thought he was a Chinese minority. They thought it was just very striking to them that he learned pretty early on that he wasn't Chinese and that you can't be Chinese if you don't look Chinese. That's their definition of it. So I was always somewhat on the outside. But coming back to the States in December 2011 after being, spending 6-7 years in China and realizing slowly what I had missed about the place and how I would defend parts of the place or aspects of the party that didn't deserve defending, and how I wouldn't look at certain things. You'd regularly walk by military installations or party installations, and you just learn to ignore them. You'd read party propaganda and you'd think it wouldn't sink in, but you just internalize some of those phrases. Again, it was easier for me because Chinese isn't my first language, and so you see something, you don't automatically process it. There's just all of these statements and phrases that are a daily reality for you when you're in China. And I didn't have the foresight or the ability to really notice and process those things until I left.
So the world of China hands, or people who look at China, it tends to be sort of artificially divided into this camp that we often will refer to as dragon slayers, the people who are more hawkish, and the people who are panda huggers, or the people who are more dovish, right? And I have a very good friend of mine here in the Stanford area who is my panda hugging friend, right? And he will sometimes say, look, it's not that I'm, although he would say, who doesn't want to hug a panda? He says, really what I want to do is I want to avoid war. And you know who you are if you're listening to this. And I think he probably will. And what he's really interested in is, how do we get from here to whatever future state that is good for the United States and avoids war with China? Tell me an optimistic story about how our policy, our combination, the factors that are involved evolve in a way that the United States doesn't end up losing, but at the same time, we don't descend into war.
So a couple thoughts on that. First, every once in a while, a drunk Chinese tourist will go into a panda cage and get mauled. So I strongly discourage anyone from hugging a panda. They're brutal. They're bears.
Safety tip.
Yes. War is very easy to prevent with China. It's very, very easy. Remove troops from Japan, remove troops from South Korea, and give up Taiwan. It's simple. It's very easy. And say, listen, Asia is China. China is the most important country in Asia, and we're focusing on our own backyard. The other way to prevent war is to think that China is radically different than it is, and the Communist Party is radically different, and then pretend that that's what prevents war. Or perhaps it does if war doesn't happen because there's some other evolution in China. I am not smart enough to come up with a strategy that prevents war and doesn't weaken the United States. And perhaps World War II killed tens of millions of people. World War III could kill more. And so perhaps the right strategy is for the U.S. to retrench and the U.S. to give up and, create peace in our time, and just hope that Beijing, after taking Taiwan and taking the Senkakus, stops.
That worked really well the first time.
So Ray and I spent time in Australia where we met with some of the guys who said basically what you just said. That's a shame, but U.S.'s time has passed. Preemptive surrender is the way to go. And we can all live happily ever after. What's interesting to us, we don't know that much about China, but we know Southeast Asia. We're there, we hear a lot of, we want you to stay and balance China. They speak very quietly and privately. While out in public, they are, the U.S. is a warmonger, and, and at some point, especially under the Trump administration, that effort to straddle the dragon may not work. Now, I don't know if you're a Southeast Asia guy, but what will they do? What will the Southeast Asians do?
I think Vietnam's the most interesting one here, both from a trade perspective, but also from a political perspective, in that the new leader does seem to be more amenable to Beijing. It's the only country that's managed to host Biden, Xi Jinping, and Putin, which is quite a feat. From a trade perspective, it is also a repressive communist country that should worry folks in compliance, but worries them a lot less because there's a lot less U.S. focus on Vietnamese abuses than arguably there should be. I think Cambodia and Laos are basically Chinese client states and will remain such. And Laos is only a focus here for the U.S. legacy there, and for it also being one of the few remaining communist countries. It very rarely gets any U.S. policy attention, but I guess for 5 million people, that's perhaps okay. I think Burma is fascinating on this, and parts of Burmese drug warlords, already have very close ties to the Chinese military and Chinese intelligence. I think as a region, the way you described it, James, is absolutely accurate. That people, with the exception, I would say, of the Philippines, want to be able to say, oh, yes, we want to say some nasty things about the U.S. We absolutely need you there. And I think you have that in other regions as well. We've seen that in some countries across Africa and across Latin America as well, where leaders feel like they can't publicly criticize China, or they do. Like Milei used to be very publicly critical of China and has said much nicer things about China, which is a very strange retrench for the fiery head of Argentina. But I do feel like it behooves every government around the world to understand that their U.S. and China strategy requires this kind of balancing.
All right. Well, Isaac Stonefish, we have come up on time, but I do want to give you a chance to tell people a little bit where they can follow you. Personally, I cyberstalk you on LinkedIn, but where do you think people should follow you?
Thank you. So I spend a lot more time on LinkedIn than I'm willing to admit. So LinkedIn is a place for that. Also on Twitter, or for folks that want to understand about strategy risks and our business intelligence and the due diligence we do, helping folks understand and manage their China exposure, that's strategyrisk.com.
All right, strategyrisk.com. We look forward to seeing topics such as how to avoid getting mauled by a panda and other important things at strategyrisk.com. Thanks very much for joining us. All right, Jim. Well, that was actually pretty fun and really interesting. I didn't expect to be getting into a discussion about the probability of war with a guy who does business consulting. But it seems like he is actually taking that possibility very seriously when he's talking to his own clients.
Yes. So don't go to war and don't get into a panda, the two lessons I've taken out of that.
Especially the second.
Yes. Well, I almost never climb into animal dens, but I'll try and make it more frequent. No, what I find most interesting is experts on China, whether it's him or some of the other people we speak to, are basically saying China is growing increasingly, intensively aggressive. And you and I have been talking about this since we started this podcast.
Yeah.
And where does it end, I guess, is the question that we really are trying to answer. And what was disturbing with Isaac is he says it may not end very well.
Yeah. And I mean, so of course he was being a bit tongue in cheek, or just being, sort of intentionally provocative, talking about withdrawing from the island chain around, Korea, Japan, Philippines, that area around, of course, Taiwan, around China, and retrenching. But China really does look at it that way. I mean, that's actually what they want to see happen. They don't think that we belong there. And that really is a primary objective. But in his Peace in Our Time little comment, he sort of gave up the game, which is an expansionist power is never satisfied with any territorial gains that you give them. They always look out and see the next island chain. They see the next thing. The Peace in Our Time quote, of course, goes back to pre-World War II. And my good friend who I have this debate with and who likes to hug pandas will often say, hey, we don't want to turn into, always bring up Nazi Germany as the analogy. And that's true. I mean, there's no perfect analogy. You can't draw, conclusions solely based on an historical analogy, but they are important data points. And we do know something, at least sort of systematically, about authoritarian expansionist regimes, is that it's really hard for them to stop doing that. Once they begin to get their appetite whetted, that tends to encourage more expansion.
Well, I'm going to take the Chinese comeback to that, which is we started off with the Monroe Doctrine, right? Western Hemisphere is basically a U.S. hemisphere. And the Chinese are saying, right, we agree with you, and the Eastern Hemisphere is ours. So if we divide up the world this way, we can all get along, and the world will be a much more ordered place because we'll police it together.
And I think that part of that, of course, there is a sense in which China was historically unlucky and geographically unlucky, frankly. And so the world got small, with the advent the advent of all kinds of new technologies and all kinds of those things, at a time when China was historically weak. And that's that whole 100 years of humiliation, whereas essentially all the Western powers sort of flooded in and began to sort of pick up all kinds of advantages in their backyard. And at the same time, we're sort of creating strategic space for themselves, especially the United States. And that's the U.S.'s great geographical advantages, is that our hemisphere is largely populated by countries that are pretty easy for us to deal with and are not immediate threats to our sovereignty. And they don't have that geographic advantage, right? And they would kind of like to have it. And so, I can almost get it, except for the price of sort of saying, okay, we agree, we'll split the world in half, and you can have your half, and we'll take our half. Is there's all these other countries with agency that are like, wait a minute, time out. We didn't agree to this. We didn't sign up to this. Japan's not just going to simply roll over and say, oh, that's fine. We'll go ahead and join China's team.
It depends what the deal would be. If it's enforced neutrality, especially if the U.S. abandons it, maybe they'd go for that. I don't know. It is. I don't know how America First is going to be translated under the new Trump 2.0. And he mentioned that this is a deal he actually worries about, Isaac.
Yeah.
Because it might suit them.
I think, and again, we lived in another country together at a place in time when Trump 1.0 was in the midst of figuring out what that administration was going to do. And there was, of course, lots of worry in Australia where we were about that, and in a lot of other places. But when we look around at some of the appointments that have been made, it's not filled with China doves. There are people in there. We talked about Elon Musk, who are definitely give pause or place for pause and say, I wonder what these voices will have to do with it. I did find it really interesting and a very, very provocative, the idea that in the end, Donald Trump and Elon Musk, neither of those people is used to sort of sharing the spotlight, right? They're all sort of the star of their own show. How long can the bromance really go on before there's sort of necessarily a divide that happens?
Well, Ray, it works for me and you as two alpha males, but we're divided electronically.
Yeah. Well, that's except for the times when we have to sort of throw down the gloves and go at it for about, just like a good hockey match.
Thank God for Ian playing referee.
Exactly. All right. Well, Jim, this is, as always, a lot of fun. And I want to thank you for joining me. It was great to have just seen you there in New York. Ian skipped out on us something about a wedding. I don't know. He's got his confused priorities. But regardless, you should, if you're not already doing it, you should certainly be following him on X at Ian Ellis Jones to keep up with what he has to say. He is growing so many more followers all the time for his really outstanding geopolitical summaries of a lot of what's going on in the world. Now, of course, if you enjoy us, go to youtube.com. IP Podcast is where you can find us if you want to watch our pretty faces. If you want to go back and see the person who actually advised us to interview Isaac Stone Fish, I'm talking about Lieutenant General Lori Reynolds, retired U.S. Marine Corps, who talked about why should we care about China's cyber aggression back in episode 4. That is especially timely right now as we're seeing all of these impacts of the Salt Typhoon hack. So if you want to learn more about that, please go back to episode 4 and listen to Lieutenant General Lori Reynolds. You can follow us on X at Indo-Pac Podcast. You can follow us on your favorite streaming service, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Just look up our name, Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific? And, of course, you can follow us on LinkedIn, where I cyberstalk Isaac Stone Fish. And until our next time, we wish you well on Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?